Hello, and welcome to another episode of Beastly Talks. I'm your host, Stian Helling, and this podcast is coming out a little bit late. I have had a lot of issues with power outages and internet recently, so I'm a little bit behind schedule, but hopefully it's not out too late. Hopefully you've been patient with me and are waiting for the second part of the Pressure Mastery podcast. I've gotten some really good feedback on the first one. I think a lot of people were quite surprised at, how big the topic of pressure actually is, because it's very easy to just think of pressure as a tool-based training, right? So applying some form of pressure to either create negative reinforcement or positive punishment with the tool. But yeah, it really does go a hell of a lot further than that. And it is a much bigger topic than a lot of people think that it is. So I'm happy to hear that people have found it interesting. And yeah, so the last episode was more on comprehension to kind of get an idea of the meaning of pressure and how it kind of applies to dog and just the world in general. Now, in this one, I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about how I utilize different forms of pressure in training. How I implement tools, how I implement, spatial pressure, little things like that in order to get the most out of my dog and out of my training. So, without further ado, we do have quite a bit to go through here as well, so I'm just going to get stuck into it. Now, I want to start by saying one thing that I say to all, or have said to all of my students in the past, and that is that I can teach you absolutely everything that I know about dog training, but the one thing I cannot teach you is experience. And getting experience actually does mean getting out there and getting your hands on dogs, putting different tools on dogs and utilizing them and seeing the response in the dog. And unfortunately, it also does mean making mistakes from time to time. Now, what I'm hoping to do with all of this education here is to give you some clear guidelines how to work, or some clear guidelines to work within, so that hopefully you can minimize the amount of mistakes you have to make, therefore get the results that you need quicker, with less stress being put on the dog. Because, implementing pressure into your training does cause a little bit of stress in the dog. Right. But again, as I've talked about in the past, stress or eustress, which is a low level of stress that is actually crucial in order for learning to take place, is just that. It is crucial in order for learning to take place. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to make too many mistakes to the point where we confuse the dog and push the dog from low levels of eustress into high levels of distress, because that is when learning stops taking place. And that's where we start just completely miscommunicating with our dogs. So hopefully all of this will help you just push your training to that next stage and get the results that you need a little bit quicker. Now, I have worked with a lot of dogs. I have worked with pretty much every tool that there is in dog training, and I have made many mistakes along the way. And again, it's as unfortunate as it is. Mistakes is actually probably the part where you learn the most. So you can You can teach a lot through positive reinforcement and through gentle motivation, etc., etc. But when you actually make a mistake and you see the consequences of that mistake, or you feel the consequences on your body, like I've done a couple of times, if the first time I put a slip lead on the dog and the dog freaks out and actually climbs the leash and bites me. You know, that does happen. It's not very pleasant, but it is unfortunately just part of learning. That's just how it is. But yeah, hopefully with all of this, I can make it a little bit easier for you to get to where you need to be a little bit quicker and minimize the amount of mistakes you make along the way. So I'll start off by really quickly reiterating something from the last podcast. And that is essentially breaking down the different types of pressure that we have. So we talk about spatial pressure, which is using our body language, movement, right? Stepping towards a dog to make them step back, getting into their personal space to shift something happening, or like what I'm doing with my little puppy Goodnight at the moment, is I'm working on his place command. So I send him to place. He's very happy to go there, but he hasn't quite learned how to stay there yet. So what I do is I send him to place. I don't give him a release command. I just take a step away and he naturally gets off to follow me. Right now, I step back towards him while saying no, and he jumps back up on the place board. And now I can take 2 or 3 steps back without him getting off. So I'm actually using just my body to correct him, to put him back on place, to get him to understand that unless I give him a break command, he is not meant to get off the place. Again, dogs are inherently good at reading body language. So it's actually a really good tool to use. We then have physical slash tactile pressure, and this is actual pressure that the dog feels on its body, right? So that can be the leash, right? We pull on the collar or harness, the dog feels pressure that activates the dog in one way, form, or shape. We can put our hands on the dog to teach them to be handled, like touching their paws to get them ready for nail trims, etc. It can be an electric collar that sits on them, grabbing their collar, just grabbing and holding a regular flat collar. A lot of dogs freak out about that, but that is a crucial skill for the dog to learn, because sometimes when we're at the vet, when we're at the groomer, we just need to restrain the dog and we need to get them used to that. And again, that brings me to restraint, which is like holding the dog in some form or shape and getting them to be compliant with that. Hunger as well is a tactile, physical driver of motivation, right? So when you feel hungry, you're driven to alleviate that pressure and to acquire some food. So these are all the physical, tactile sensations that we can utilize as pressure in our training. Then we have psychological pressure, which is things like putting a dog under command, right? If you ask your dog to drop and you expect them to remain in that command the whole time the dog is under command, they are under a low form of pressure because they have to withstand whatever it is that's happening around them, and they have to focus on maintaining the position that they're in. So yes, just putting a dog under command is a form of pressure. Then we have natural drives, dogs with high levels of prey drive that are really driven for toys or for chasing rabbits, whatever it may be. That is a psychological pressure that the dog is looking to fulfill and alleviate, which is something we use a lot in our training when we're teaching dogs to play, to put more intensity into behaviors, right? When we train with food, for example, we tend to get a low level of arousal and low level of intensity, which is good for teaching something new. But as the dog becomes more proficient, as we start getting into the proofing stage, especially with high drive dogs, we want to transition over to toys or something more arousing and harder for the dog to withstand against, essentially, to solidify the training, to help the dog learn to think and work through drives, to make them more stable and to create more biological fulfillment. Another psychological form of pressure is obviously safety. Safety is probably the number one concern, I would say, for a lot of dogs. And if a dog doesn't feel safe, nothing else is going to happen. If they don't feel safe, they're not going to take food. They're not going to chase after a ball, right? They are going to do whatever they can to place themselves into a position where they feel safe. So safety is a big psychological form of pressure on the dog. We then have resource pressure, which is obviously things that are valuable to the dog, such as food, toys, access to the couch, being able to be put on the bed. These are kind of seen as high status things in the dog's mind because it's something that is very valuable to us. And if you have a dog that is driven by a lot of social pressure, then, these things become really valuable to them. And it can be a crate. Some dogs love their crate so much they don't want other dogs to go near it, etc., etc. And then finally, we have social pressure, which is, access to other dogs in the pack, so to speak, or even family members, right? Dogs that are highly socially driven are very focused on being around their pack structure, right? They're people, they're other dogs. And other forms of social pressure is posturing and dominance, right? So a puppy walks up to an old dog, they might bare their teeth, they might growl at the puppy, right? This is the dog putting social pressure on the puppy to back off, give them space. Corrections happen if a puppy is being rude, is biting the older dog too hard, jumping on them, whatever it may be. They might snap and correct the dog, right? This is also a form of social pressure. And then, yeah, finally we have, what we call pack pressure. So the desire to be part of the pack hierarchy that has been structured in the household that the dog lives in. And this is particularly important for puppies because they want to fit in. They want to learn to communicate properly with the other dogs and, to find a harmonious way to live with the other dogs that are in the pack. So spatial, physical, tactile, psychological, resource, and social. These are kind of the different forms of pressure that we tend to use in our training and in our proofing stages, and even to create just a harmonious household. Now, it is important to understand that dogs and humans and really every living, thinking, feeling organism on this planet is hardwired to understand pressure. Every living, feeling, thinking organism is driven toward something appetitive, something that is pleasant or desirable, and away from something that is aversive. Now, J-Jack has he's an American trainer. Definitely look him up. But he always talks about the fact that happiness is resistance overcome. Right. So being able to be challenged in some way, form, or shape and learn how to push through that, to control that situation, to overcome adversity is crucial in order to create resilience in a dog and creating a dog that feels powerful and feels like they're in control and that they have the power to work through adversity. This is crucial to understand because this is how we build strong, confident dogs that are set up to go through a difficult, stressful life. Because unfortunately, life is stressful, it is difficult, and it is something we need to learn to power through. So while it's important to teach dogs to overcome some adversity, to fight through some pressure, And to build strength and confidence, mental resilience is super important. But again, as with everything, balance is key, right? So Bart Bellin, who is the inventor of the Nipopo training system, has this really great analogy where he talks about how some dogs' life has been all cream. They have never had to do anything unpleasant. They've never had to overcome anything. They've always had access to everything they wanted, attention from their humans, food, toys, just everything all the time. Their life has been all cream. Now, that actually creates a weak dog. And so, our job as dog trainers, when a dog's life has been all cream, is to start stirring in a little bit of shit, right? And that little bit of shit comes in the form of adversity and pressure, whether that is physical pressure, whether it's just training the dog to overcome adversity and difficulty. But on the flip side of that, we have some dogs that have only ever had shit, right? They might have been poorly bred. They might have had terrible socialization as young. They might have had too much pressure applied to them and have had too little safety, too little reinforcement, right? Their life has just been rough and tough all the time. And so in that case, the opposite has to happen. Now it's time for us to start stirring some cream into the shit to alleviate and take away some of that pressure that the dog is experiencing and give them relief and begin the process of saying, like, hey, life isn't always going to be shit. Actually, really good things can happen to you. And yeah, the cream versus shit thing, I think, makes so much sense, right? Because too much joy, no adversity leads to weakness. Too much shit and too little enjoyment leads to a dog being flat. So again, it all comes back to balance. We have to have a little bit of everything. There has to be darkness in order for there to be light. There has to be pain in order for there to be pleasure, right? We cannot just eliminate one thing and think that that is just going to be great for everyone and everything. It's really interesting because, you know, some of the happiest people on the planet are people who like Aboriginal tribes, you know, who have little access to things. They, you know, they have to have weapons to protect themselves from predators. They have to hunt in order to get food. They have to build shelters and constantly maintain those shelters because they don't have, you know, super fancy building materials like we have. Now, these people always live under a certain level of stress and they're always powering through that stress. But what's important to understand is that alleviation of pressure, whether that is physical pressure or social or psychological pressure, it doesn't really matter. But having that pressure taken away is a highly rewarding experience. So when you are moving away from being under pressure and being pushed to do something and you overcome that, you succeed and you come out on the flip side of that, that is actually one of the most rewarding things that you can experience, far more rewarding than having too much access to many things. I recently picked up a book that's called The Dopamine Nation, and it's written by a Dr. Anna Lemke, who is an American psychologist. I think if I'm not saying that completely incorrect, and I was absolutely mesmerized by this book, and I literally powered through it. It's like 200 pages, and I read the whole thing in like 2 days because I became a little bit obsessed with it because I saw so many important links to how training with pressure for a dog and how overwhelming excess of too many things causes some form of anxiety. And she talks a lot about what she calls the dopamine discomfort mechanism. So in psychology, there is often talk of pleasure and pain. Now, pain and pleasure in this instant isn't just physiological pain, it's psychological pain. Right. And when people hear the word pain, they think of something that is extremely physically unpleasant, like cutting yourself or something. But that's not really what they talk about here. It's pressure and adversity. Right. It's something trialing that needs to be overcome. Now, the what she calls the dopamine discomfort mechanism is explained as a dopamine spike after discomfort is a natural neurobiological process where the brain releases feel-good neurotransmitters following a period of stress or pain. Now, to go a little bit deeper into that, so dopamine is often mistaken for the happiness drug in the body, which isn't actually correct because dopamine is linked to the seeking part of our brain, meaning we're always looking for relief from pressure and we're looking to acquire something pleasant. Now, what Dr. Lemke says in this book is that the problem with the dopamine nation that we live in now is that dopamine is perfectly created for an environment of scarcity, right? It is meant to drive us, to get us to keep going, to find safety, to find food, to find everything that we need in order to be comfortable and fulfilled. However, the problem is in this day and age that we live in, we have in excess of everything. We always have access to food. We have, big safe shelters. We have taken ourselves out of the food chain, right? Humans are the only animal on the planet that is completely eliminated from the food chain. Now, some humans do get killed by animals, but we're not out in the wild fending for ourselves on a daily basis. So what's happened is we have ended up with so much cream in our life that we actually become addicted through other dopamine releases. And so I think she breaks it down. Like, I want to do a whole podcast on her book because it's fantastic. And I think it relates so much to dog training. But the brain is always looking for homeostasis, which is a balance between what she calls the pleasure and pain seesaw. So you picture a seesaw going up and down, and when there's too much pressure or too much pain, it pushes too far in one end. So now automatically the brain starts looking for pleasure to neutralize and balance the seesaw. But again, when it goes the other way and there's too much pleasure, now the brain is actually looking for pain to bring the brain back into homeostasis. And this is where a lot of addiction comes from. So when there's too much cream, we end up essentially becoming addicted to things. And so she breaks it down into, she talks about obviously sugar or high levels of calorie is an addiction. It's alcohol and drugs. It is pornography, gambling, and gaming. I think those are the primary addictions that she brings forward. And so we're actually looking for that new dopamine hit all the time. But because our life is all cream, we have to seek out high stakes activities in order to gain that dopamine spike that we've been looking for, which is what gives us the release of dopamine, which is associated with motivation and reward. And so that's where the whole society nowadays is a little bit disjointed, because by having too much, we actually have increased levels of anxiety and depression and mental health issues. And it's literally because our lives are too easy. We never experience pain. And so we almost go to seek that out in order to find some kind of level pleasure pain seesaw situation. So another thing that she says is, unlike the fast-acting, short-lived spikes from instant gratification, like sugar and social media. Actually, social media is the final thing that she talks about being a massive driver for dopamine addiction. But yeah, from the short-lived spikes we get from instant gratification, like sugar or social media, voluntary controlled discomfort, such as cold immersion or intense exercise, induces a slower, more sustained, and healthier increase in dopamine. So, by actually making ourselves experience pain, by making ourselves go through something unpleasant and fight through it, we don't end up with this desire to look for instant spikes of dopamine. It becomes a longer living release of dopamine throughout the day or our lives. And this is interesting because in this day and age, we shelter our dogs from so many things, and all the things that we shelter them from, all the access that we give them, the hundreds of toys that they have access to all the time, the 3 food bowls that are always full. All of this excess, this cream that the dog is experiencing, is actually making them anxious because they are looking for some difficulty. And that's where the lack of resilience becomes really evident. In dogs that have never had to go through anything difficult, they've been shielded from every form of adversity. They have no stress tolerance. They have no tolerance for pressure in any form or shape whatsoever. And so just leaving the house makes them reactive, because the second they aren't in that little bubble where everything is safe and controlled all the time, they have no coping mechanism. And so this is where the use of pressure actually becomes one of the best teachers in order to create a strong, resilient dog. But yeah, definitely look up The Dopamine Nation by Dr. Anna Lemke. It's a fantastic book. And one other thing that is mentioned as well, when it comes to dopamine, is rather than only mediating pleasure, dopamine functions as a motivational salience signal that drives wanting. So the desire to pursue rewards and avoid discomfort. Again, this comes back to every living, thinking, feeling being is hardwired to understand pressure, to work towards something appetitive and away from something aversive. But when the scales are tipped too far in one side, it breaks us mentally. It's that simple. The brain just doesn't operate properly when everything is pleasure or everything is pain. Now, at this point, it's probably good to get into talking a little bit about what we call hard dogs and what we call soft dogs. So you'll often hear people talk about a certain type of dog being a harder dog and another breed of dog being a softer dog. And so what we mean by hard and soft is essentially the dog's genetic and natural resilience levels and sensitivity to training. So a hard dog would be a dog that can withstand much more adversity and fight through difficulty in order to get to the relief of getting away from the pain, but also to acquire the appetitive, right? So this is kind of, it's all based on genetics, drive, body structure and health, um, early conditioning, like what we've taught them from a young age and fight response, fight or flight response. Like how easily triggered is the dog by stresses and pressure. So essentially, a hard dog you can put through much more adversity and difficulty and they won't break under it. Whereas a soft dog is a dog that cracks more easily. So we have to be gentler with them. And we still have to nudge them. We still have to introduce aversives to them. But we have to do it slower and a lot more controlled because they will very quickly flip to the side of giving up, right? If you have a dog that, say, couldn't give a shit about a tennis ball, for example, and you try to make that dog do something in order to get that ball, in most cases, they're just going to sit down or turn their back and walk away. They're like, no, I have no drive to climb over this obstacle you've put in front of me for the thing. Right. And so this is where we often try to increase appetitive levels. We teach the dogs to drive. To play. We teach them. We create more interest in food by making it a little bit scarce. I'm not saying starve your dog, but put them on an existential feeding program, meaning the dog doesn't have free access to food. They have to conduct behaviors and go through training to work with you in order to acquire that food. A lot of these things increase salience for the specific reward, right? And the more desire we have for the reward, the more desire there is to go through something unpleasant. Right. And just think of something you really like yourself. Right. Say you really enjoy chocolate, but you're not that fond of carrots. Right. If someone goes like, hey, I want you to walk barefoot over this unpleasant surface and I'll give you a carrot, you're probably going to go like, do you know what? Fuck that. I'm not going through this adversity for that low level reward. Right. I have no interest in that. And so you walk away from the challenge. Whereas if there is a chocolate bar or something much more pleasurable on the opposite end, you will go like, you know what? I am going to go through this. I am going to withstand this discomfort and this pressure in order to acquire the reward that I want. Now, this is a good example of finding that balance, right? To learn to overcome some adversity. And again, what's important to understand here is that release of pressure through negative reinforcement is a high essentially for your body because the release of dopamine is so big that you have come out as the winner essentially. That the innate reward is internalized. It's not external. It's not getting the chocolate that is the big reward. It is you fighting through the difficulty and succeeding. That is the biggest reward. And again, hard and soft dogs. Sorry, I went a little bit off topic there, but hard and soft dogs is basically how much pressure we put into the training, how hard we push dogs, and how quickly we do it. Now, one thing to note here as well is that dogs can be hard and soft at the same time. Now, that might seem a little bit contradictory, but my Malinois, Agner, is actually a really good example of this. So, Agner has incredible mental and physical resilience in our training, especially when we're playing. He will fucking run through a glass window to get to his tug. Right? He will punch into walls. He will backflip off of my chest. He will scream, bark, fight, anything to get that thing. No matter how many obstacles I put in front of him, he will find a way through them. And he injures himself often when we do this because he has no self-preservation in that scenario. But he's also incredibly sensitive to commands and even to physical pressure from, say, like the electric collar. So even like giving him a stimulation at a level 10 on the electric collar, which is level 10 out of 100, so 10% of what the e-collar can do, he will respond very quickly to it because he is soft to hearing commands from me and to feeling the physical pressure. But the higher he goes in drive, the more he wants the appetitive at the end of it, which is generally his tug, right? The more hard he becomes, the more things he will fight through. But at the same time, even in full drive and full biting craziness, at the smallest correction on an e-collar will make him change. And so this is kind of what we mean when we say that a dog can be hard and soft at the same time. They can be soft and quick to respond to physical pressure, while at the same time going through fire and hell to get to the thing that they want. All right, so it's time to get into some of the actual practical stuff here. I do want to touch on one thing real quick, though, which is something I've observed a lot by watching other trainers, by watching dog training students, but also more importantly, watching dog owners. And that is how good dog trainers are at using their bodies. And so, what I mean by that is most people are relatively unaware of how they're utilizing their bodies, right? A lot of people tend to be quite animated, right? So they'll use their arms a lot while they're explaining something. They will move, fidget, and kind of overcompensate with their bodies when they're telling a story, for example. Whereas dog trainers are very considered of how we stand, how we carry ourselves, how we hold our bodies. And this is why dogs tend to respond very differently to the average person versus a dog trainer, right? Because we will actively think about how we hold our bodies. We will be less animated in front of a fearful dog because that is more likely to trigger them, right? We will also give no response if a dog shows something like aggression towards us. Because if a dog barks at me and I squeal and step back, then I'm actually giving in to the pressure that's being applied from the dog, which further increases the power of the aggression in the dog's mind. And so the way that we stand, the way that we carry our bodies, the way that we move, whether it's, fast and animated for a young dog or a puppy, right? To make them go like, hey, oh my God, you're so interesting. And you move quickly and you almost trigger prey drive in me just by the way you hold your toy or move back away from, right? But also at the same time, if we have a particularly fearful dog, you want to be like fearful or even aggressive, because a lot of aggression is born out of fear. But we try to avoid big animated movements because that movement can trigger the dog into an aggressive reaction. We avoid direct eye contact because direct eye contact in the wild is almost like a challenge, right? So we don't want to do that. We don't want to lean over the dog. We don't want to impose ourselves on the dog, which is kind of a domineering trait in the wild where the alpha animal will puff themselves up. Gorillas beat their chest while hunching over. Wolves will put their hackles up, push their bodies out, and bare their teeth, right? We don't want to accidentally simulate any of these things, especially when we're dealing with a dog that has aggression or fear issues. And so and again, keeping in mind that a lot of fast movement will trigger prey in a dog. And if you have a very sensitive dog, that prey can very quickly also trigger into a fear response or an aggressive response. So it's actually really interesting watching how kind of still a lot of dog trainers are when they're standing. So you'll see, like, if you just look up a trainer online and you watch how they're standing talking to an average dog owner that's just holding onto the leash. And the average dog owner is fidgeting with the leash. They're moving it from hand to hand. They're holding, they're pulling on the dog. They're kind of waving their arms while they're talking in an animated voice, and the dog is kind of bouncing left, right, and center, while the trainer is just standing there completely still like a statue. And these are things that you learn with experience. And and it's something I didn't even know that I did until I started seeing videos of myself. When I was running workshops, for example, people were filming me and sending them to me afterwards. And I'm like, oh, actually, I noticed that I moved in a very particular way. And this is, coming back to what I tell my students is I can teach you all the knowledge that I have about dog training, but I cannot teach you experience. A lot of new students, people who want to become dog trainers, they do move quickly. They kinda I think because holding the leash, getting treats, moving with the dog, it's not second nature to them yet, so they overcompensate by trying to do more. But yeah, think about how you approach. Think about how you stand, because you can accidentally use pressure on the dog and trigger them into a behavior that you didn't actually want to see. But these are the little things that most people aren't aware of. And so I'm just pointing them out here, that the next time you watch a trainer online, look at how they stand, look at how they hold their bodies, and look at different dogs that they work with. Watch them work with an aggressive dog, watch them play with a puppy, and you'll see very different approaches to how we utilize pressure or how we alleviate pressure with our bodies. So just an interesting little, I guess, just an interesting little thing that I've noticed over the years, that is actually really a big deal. So a good thing to be aware of. All right, let's get stuck into it. So first thing I want to talk about is conditioning pressure. And a lot of people often ask me, what does it actually mean to condition pressure? And it essentially means teaching a specific type of pressure to a dog, and more importantly, how the dog can master that pressure. And what we mean by mastering pressure is that the dog can actively understand how to eliminate that pressure when it happens, and more importantly, how to avoid the pressure from happening altogether down the line. So, again, especially negative reinforcement is referred to as escape and avoidance training, right? So the dog feels some form of pressure, whether it's psychological or physical. And we teach them that, hey, when this sensation begins, what I'm expecting of you is to alter your behavior in some way, form, or shape, and the pressure will be alleviated, right? And this works both through negative reinforcement and through positive punishment. And really, what it is, so some forms of pressure, again, are very natural. Spatial pressure isn't really taught, right? We can teach the dog to understand it a little bit better, but in most cases, it's innate. The dog's born with an understanding of, well, they have personal space, essentially. And when we move into that personal space, that triggers a behavior in one way, form, or shape, right? Whereas more specific types of pressure, so from tools especially, comes needs to be conditioned. It needs to be taught to the dog that, hey, this thing that you're wearing now, that sensation that you've never experienced before, that actually holds a meaning. And again, that's where conditioning the pressure comes in. So say, for example, with a slip lead. So slip lead, if you're not familiar with, is an open-ended loop that tightens and releases as we pull on the leash. Now, what we want to do with that is we want to first teach the dog to follow the leash and the pressure. Now, the first time I put a slip on a dog that has never had one before, simply what I do is I put the slip collar on the dog, I attach a leash to it, and I walk to the end of the leash so that I'm, 6 foot away from the dog. Now, at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to very gently start pulling the leash towards me. Now, when I pull the leash towards me, what happens is the slip collar tightens around the dog's neck, which applies aversive pressure. And most dogs at this point will immediately kick into what we call opposition reflex. So opposition reflex is when some form of pressure is applied to you and you pull away in opposition of that pressure. So an example is, say, for example, imagine that you had never, ever in your life experienced someone grabbing your jumper. Right. So you'd never experienced someone pinching your jumper with 2 fingers and pulling it in a direction. Right. Now, most people have experienced this because we're taught that as little kids. Hey, when I pull on your jumper, you turn around and you look at me and the pulling stops. Right. That pressure has been conditioned into us. But if you'd never, ever had that sensation and someone suddenly walked up and grabbed your jumper, what would be your immediate response? Well, you would pull in the opposite direction of where the pressure was going. Right. So the second someone grabs your jumper and pulls on it, you pull away from them. Right. This is a natural response in any prey animal, because when you feel trapped, you start fighting against, you activate into opposition reflex because something's clamped down on you and you have to get away in order to survive. Right. So this is an evolutionary response that every living thing has. Right. And so this is what happens when you, again, put a new tool on the dog like a slip lead and you start gently pulling on it. The dog experiences the new sensation of the slip tightening around its neck and it goes, what the hell is this? I don't understand how this works. And so the natural evolutionary response becomes then to kick into opposition reflex and to pull back away from the slip. Now, at this point, what I do is I just become a tree, essentially, and lock myself into place. I just hold the leash. I'm not pulling harder because I'm not trying to make the dog move. I'm not trying to drag the dog. That's not the purpose of this. But what happens is, for as long as that pressure is applied to the dog, the longer the dog is aware of the pressure, the more sensitized to it they become. And so the dog tries to pull back a little. They might shake their head a little. They might even jump up and down. They might try to sit, right? They're offering alternative behaviors to go, how do I turn this off? But eventually, every dog is going to take one step forwards. And what I mean by that is they're going to follow the direction of the leash that I'm pulling on. The second the dog follows that leash, I'm going to release pressure. I'm going to alleviate the pressure that the dog's feeling on its neck, thereby rewarding them with negative reinforcement. So I apply physical pressure, something unpleasant to the dog. Again, not high levels of pain. We're not correcting or punishing the dog. We're just putting a little bit of pressure on their neck. Dog pulls away. I remain steadfast. I do not move. I do not pull harder on the leash. I simply hold it. The dog then eventually puts one little paw forwards and comes a centimeter closer to me, and I immediately say yes and alleviate that pressure. Very quickly, the dog's going to go like, aha, the direction you're pulling me in is the direction you want me to go. And that is how I alleviate the pressure in the future. Now we're conditioning the dog to understand the slip lead, to understand that whenever that leash goes tight, whenever the sensation of the slip around the dog's neck activates, that is a signal to the dog to look in our direction and move in our direction, not to fight against it. That's one example of conditioning tool pressure. Another one is obviously using an electric collar, where the electric stimulation doesn't mean anything to the dog, right? The first time they feel it, they just look a bit confused because they're like, what the hell is this thing on my neck, right? But now what we do is we start combining that sensation of the electric collar that they've never felt before with the known command. When the known command is then executed, the pressure is alleviated. And the dog learns, hey, I'm in control of this, right? That's what we talk about when we talk about mastering aversives. It's teaching the dog, you're in control of this. Yes, I'm applying it to you, but you can control it by simply changing your behavior. So, for example, with the electric collar, like I am going to do an episode just on electric collars where I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on this. But the way that I condition the electric collar is I teach the dog 3 commands. I teach them sit, which obviously means put your bum on the ground. I teach them place, which means run away from me to this specific spot. Essentially, go to your bed, right? But trained as a command, not a polite suggestion. And then finally, the recall command, so come back to me. So now we have 3 behaviors. We have 2 active behaviors, one which is go away from me to this place away from me, and then come back towards me into my space. And finally, we have a stationary behavior, which is sit, put your bum on the ground. Now that I have those 3, and I just teach them with food, right? And with toys for some dogs, but in most cases with food because it's easier for the dog to learn. Now, when the dog has control of those 3 behaviors, now what I do is I find the lowest level that the dog can feel on the electric collar. I pretty much only use mini educators, which is from eCollar Technologies in America. And they have 100 levels. I cannot feel anything until about a level 11 or 12. Most dogs can feel them somewhere between a 2 and a 6, I find. And the first thing that we do is we try and work out the lowest perceivable level that the dog can feel. So we put the e-collar on level 1, we press the button, we do that a couple of times, and we're looking for any form of change in the dog, right? Look to the side, the mouth closing, lip, like tongue getting pulled in, a raise of the eyebrows, right? It can be super subtle. But what you'll find is as you're increasing levels, you go from 1 to 2, tap, 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 go to 2 to 3, tap, tap, tap. At some point, the dog will make a slight behavioral change every time you tap the button. And that is a clear indication in most cases that the dog is feeling the e-collar but doesn't know what it is. They're just aware of it, that it's there. Right. Now what we do is we start on a continuous module, meaning when I press and hold the button, there's continuous pressure from the electric collar, like an electric tapping sensation, essentially. Now I press and hold the button and I ask the dog to sit. Now, when that dog's bum hits the ground, and exactly when it hits the ground, I turn the electric collar off. Now the dog goes, that weird sensation on my neck started, and I was told to do something. I did the thing under some confusion because the dog doesn't know what the new thing on its neck is. But I completed the behavior and the thing went away. Right? Now I'm training the dog to understand you can control and remove the pressure by simply paying attention to what I'm telling you. Then I press and hold the button. I ask the dog to go to place. The dog runs away from me and jumps on whatever platform I've chosen for them. The second all four paws touch that platform, the electric collar turns off. I then press the button again and I ask the dog to come to me. The second they start running towards me, I turn the pressure off from the electric collar. Now we rinse and repeat this over and over and over again. And what we see after a little while is the behaviors begin to speed up. The dog begins sitting quicker. He starts running to the place quicker. He starts running into our space quicker. Now what happens is the dog begins to understand, aha, when this thing on my neck happens, I need to pay attention because the quicker I conduct this specific behavior, the quicker the pressure goes away. So now we're essentially tapping the dog on the shoulder to get their attention. When we get their attention, we ask them to do something. The faster they produce the result that we've asked for, the quicker they control the pressure that is applied. That's conditioning pressure. We're basically teaching something brand new that the dog is unaware of and doesn't know how to control it. But once they master it, it becomes a really clear signal to the dog that we can apply whenever we need the dog to perform a specific behavior or we need their attention drawn to us. Or later on, if we're dealing with problem behaviors, we can use them to correct or punish a specific behavior as well. But to me, it's always important that the dog understands what is happening to it and that it understands how to stop that thing from happening. All right, time for the big one. So I'm going to break down my pressure matrix. Essentially, this is every way that I use pressure actively in my training. And it's broken down essentially into 9 different squares. Now, it might be worth just having a pen and paper in front of you to kind of dot this down. Because, yeah, there is a bit of information here. So, there are 3 levels of pressure that we can apply to a dog. That is a low level pressure, it's a medium level of pressure, and it's a high level of pressure. Now, again, a lot of people, when they hear these things, they automatically think about an electric collar. And that's one way of doing it. But again, this can be with a prong collar. It can be with a slip lead. It can be the level at which you move towards a dog, that you use your body to activate or deactivate a behavior. It can be voice commands, right? But they can come in low, medium, and high intensity, essentially, right? A low level sit is different from shouting sit, right? And so on and so forth. So low, medium, and high intensity pressure. Now, all pressure can come at 3 times. It can come before a behavior, it can come during a behavior, and it can come after a behavior. So now we have low, medium, high at the top, and we have B for before, D for during, and A for after down. So now we've created 9 squares. So this is how I put all my pressure training together. If I use low level pressure before a behavior, That is an activation signal. So when I pull on the lead, before I've asked the dog to do something, the dog feels the pressure and they're going to look to me for direction. How do I turn this off? So it becomes a signal for a dog to activate into a specific behavior. That's low level pressure before a behavior. Now, medium level pressure before a behavior will increase intensity in that behavior. So if I go from a low level pull on the leash to a bit of a pop, that's going to increase the dog's drive level and make them move into the behavior with more intensity. That's medium before. Then finally, we have high level pressure before a behavior, and that is to create superstition. What do we mean by that? So superstitious behavior in dog training is when we take two things that are not linked together, but we make the dog think they're linked together. So one example that I like to use is counter surfing. So a dog jumping on the kitchen counter and eating something. Now, this can be highly dangerous. So what we want to do is we want to create a superstitious behavior in the dog's mind where they think the unpleasant high-level pressure came from the bench. So the way that we do this is we set up a camera, we put an electric collar on the dog, and we leave the room. Because most dogs aren't going to counter surf when someone's in the room, right? Because they know they're going to get yelled at. So they wait till you leave the room before conducting the behavior, right? So now the punishment is contingent upon someone being there. However, when they're gone, the dog's free to do whatever it wants. So now we leave the room. We've left out some sausages on the bench. We watch the dog on the camera. The second the dog goes to jump on the bench, we tap the button at a high level, and the dog thinks that the bench conducted the correction. Now the dog becomes superstitious about the bench and they'll stay away from it, right? So that's one example of before a behavior is conducted. Now, I want to say this. When I say before and after a behavior, I mean within a second. I mean the second the dog, in the case of before, the second the dog decides to commit and get ready to conduct the behavior, in this case of jumping on the bench. So the second the dog looks at the bench, like drops his shoulder and gets ready for a jump, boom. That's when the high-level stimulation comes in, and that creates a superstitious behavior. This can also be done with snake avoidance training, where the dog sees a snake on the ground, they go to investigate, and we pair that high-level stimulation on an electric collar with the snake, and the dog becomes superstitious of the snake and goes, wow, snakes are bad because they hurt. I'm going to stay the hell away from them the next time I smell or see one again. So that's low, medium, and high before a behavior is conducted. Now, during is when a dog is in full-blown behavior and we apply pressure as the behavior is actively being conducted. So, low level pressure during a behavior is a keep going signal. So say, for example, if I'm healing with my boy Agmar. So he's in a focused heel. He's walking next to me. He's got his eyes locked on me, right? And he's doing really well. What I can do is I can quickly tap the button on an electric collar at a low level, or I can gently pop on the leash. This is effectively the same as someone tapping you on the shoulder and going like, good job, you did really great there, right? So it's actually motivational pressure to keep the dog conducting a behavior and telling them, hey, you're doing really well. I just need you to keep it up. Now, a medium level behavior, no, sorry, medium level intensity pressure during a behavior I use to shift a behavior. So, what I mean by that is especially when I'm working with, say, reactive dogs, right? I now condition the dog to understand like a slip and electric collar. That's primarily what I use when I'm dealing with reactivity. But I condition the dog to understand both the slip lead, how to follow that, and the electric collar. Hey, you got to change your behavior, and the pressure goes away. Now, say I'm out walking this dog and it sees the trigger, say, for example, the dog's dog reacting. The dog sees another dog and immediately starts barking. Now, barking at this point is an undesirable behavior because I'm trying to eliminate the reactive behavior. So, what happens now is I tighten the slip and I activate the electric collar at the same time at a medium intensity level. Now, the dog is very quickly going to go like, oof, there's a lot of pressure happening to me now. I need to switch that off. And so the dog shifts out of the reactive behavior into an alternative behavior. Then I release the pressure. So, what's the opposite of barking and lunging? Well, it's anything that isn't barking and lunging, right? Barking is undesirable, pressure is applied, the dog stops barking, the pressure is released. Now we're shifting the dog from one behavior to another. But this pressure has to be applied when the behavior is being conducted because the dog has to make the mistake so that I can push them out of the mistake and thereby reward them for doing or for choosing an alternative behavior. Very quickly, what happens is the dog now goes, well, every time I bark, this aversive pressure is applied to me. Every time I stop barking, the pressure goes away. And so the dog begins thinking, and he goes, the next time I see a dog, I'm going to choose actively not to bark at that dog and see what happens. Now the pressure doesn't come. And instead, I break out some treats or a toy, or I say good boy and pat the dog. Now we move from negative reinforcement, from shifting behavior repeatedly, into positively reinforcing the dog for the behavior that it actively conducts. This is medium intensity during a behavior. And finally, we have high level intensity during a behavior, and that is to stop and extinguish the behavior. It's essentially to punish the behavior away. So I do a fair bit of livestock aversion. So dogs that have killed sheep, chickens, livestock, chase cows, cattle, whatever it may be. Now, this is a behavior that we're just going to eliminate, right? No amount of food training is going to make the dog go, hey, it's not fun to chase and bite sheep anymore, right? And so at this point, we're going to go straight to a high level aversion. And again, this can be done with superstition. So just as the dog looks and begins to conduct the behavior, we can then stim them at a high level. But if the dog is in full-blown chase, we can still extinguish the behavior at that point. So the dog starts going after the livestock. The electric collar, in this case, activates at a really high level, and the dog is going to very quickly cease its chase of the livestock because the aversion is so high that the cost benefit is blown out of proportion, and the dog goes, fuck it, this is not worth it anymore. The dog puts the two together, and within a couple of stimulations, in most cases, the behavior is extinguished. It has been punished away. So that is high level pressure during a behavior. Then finally, we get into after a behavior. So, low intensity pressure after a behavior is to resume a behavior. So, say I ask my dog to sit. He puts his bum on the ground and I start moving around. Right? Say I'm just testing his reliability in the sit behavior. So I start just walking back and forth, right? He's meant to hold the sit at this point. However, if he breaks out of the behavior, I will say, right? I can take a step towards him. I can tap him on the e-collar. If I have a long line, I can give that a quick little pop. And all of those are telling the dog, hey, you're not done yet. Get back into the behavior that you were in. Right? So that's low level after a behavior. So after meaning the dog breaks the behavior. That is a signal to my dog to resume the behavior because you're not finished yet. Now, medium intensity pressure after a behavior is to bring about a behavior. Now, this is where people get a little bit confused because resuming a behavior and bringing about a behavior sound similar, but they're actually not. So resuming a behavior, my dog has been in a specific behavior, he has been in a sit, he has been in a drop, he decides to break. So I give him a low-level stimulation to tell him, hey, get back into the behavior, you have to continue. Now, to bring about a behavior is when you've asked the dog to do something, but the dog has not conducted the behavior. But you want to push them into doing it. So, say for example, I know they do this a lot in scent detection. So you have explosive dogs, for example, right? They might have an off day. They might be really tired. They might be distracted by something. But you need them to find out if there's a bomb in a car. What are you going to do? Right? Throwing a ball isn't going to bring about that behavior. However, a medium intensity level of pressure while giving the command is going to push the dog into that behavior. So if you have a sniff command, for example, and you say you point at a car and you say, hey, sniff. And the dog goes, actually, I'm not feeling it today. Then you go like, well, you don't have a choice. So now you activate whatever tool, right? Whether that is a prong collar, you tighten the prong, same with the slip, or you stimulate the dog on electric collar and you give the behavior again. The dog is now going to push into that behavior and we're bringing about a behavior that the dog didn't want to conduct. Right? So that's different from a dog breaking a behavior and me resuming it with a low level versus a dog that doesn't want to conduct the behavior and I push them into doing it whether they want to or not. Then finally, we have high level pressure after a behavior. And this is to punish non-compliance. So, say I have a dog that knows how to come. They have great recall. Every time I say come, they come running back to me, right? But now we find ourselves in a highly stimulating environment. So they might be in the back paddock. My back paddock is full of rabbits, is full of birds, is full of poo from various animals. And I now shout out, dog, come, right? A simple command that the dog knows, come running back to me. But my dog at this point might go, do you know what? I'm going to choose not to come because there's something better over here, right? I'm going to go sniff this dead possum instead of coming running back to you. Now we can punish the dog for non-compliance to a known command. So I've trained my recall over weeks and months with lots of positive reinforcement, lots of play, lots of activity. I've built a lot of value into it. But now I have a competing motivator that the dog goes, actually, I rather want that than to come back to you and whatever you may have. So now I can, if I have a long line, I can give a heavy pop on that while saying no. If I have an electric collar on the dog, I can give a high stimulation to say, hey, you're not allowed to blow off my recall. It's super important that you come back to me every time. But now, high level pressure after a behavior, that's punishment for non-compliance. So that breaks down the pressure matrix that I work on. Low before activate signal, medium before increase intensity in a behavior, high before create superstition, low during a behavior, keep going, medium intensity during a behavior is shift to an alternative behavior, high level during a behavior is to stop or extinguish a behavior. And finally, low stimulation after is resume behavior, get back into it. Medium after is bring about a behavior. And finally, high level stimulation after a behavior is to punish the dog for not complying with the known command. That's my complete pressure matrix. And no matter what tool I use, no matter where in the training we are, this is how I approach every different thing with pressure. All right. I hope that made sense to everyone. It does take a little bit of time to kind of wrap your head around all of the things. It takes you a lot of time to get really good at timing. And when you work with pressure, timing is crucial. That's why I do low stim conditioning with electric collars, for example, because most people get confused when they're holding an e-collar remote and they have treats and there's a lot going on and they start making mistakes. But with very low intensity pressure, even if you make a mistake, it's not a big problem. So when you're stimulating a dog on, say, a level 3 out of 100, that is so mildly uncomfortable that even if you don't get your timing just right, you're not going to make a big mistake. If you repeatedly have poor timing and use high level stimulation, you run the risk of shutting the dog down because the dog just gives up because they go, I don't know, I don't understand how to escape or avoid this pressure. It just keeps happening out of nowhere, and I just give up. And that's how, you can get what we call learned helplessness, which is essentially the dog version of depression, where the dog just goes, I don't understand this. I give up. If I just lie down and do nothing, hopefully nothing bad will happen. So when you start practicing this stuff, stay in the low level pressure area. When you have excellent timing, when you have a much better understanding of how to apply low level pressure and to get the dog to work with you to do something for you, then you can start pushing your levels a bit higher and you're less likely to make mistakes, which can create problems in your training. But hopefully this is a good guide for you on how to get started and how to start actively and properly using pressure in your training. Now, I'm nearly done. I just want to talk about a couple of more things when it comes to the use of pressure. So, I want to talk about pressure and fear slash anxiety. So, what I see a lot of people spouting online is that under no circumstance should you ever apply aversive pressure in any way, form, or shape to a dog that is fearful. The idea is that this will make the dog more fearful, and that is complete and utter fucking bullshit if you know what you're doing. When I'm working with particularly fearful dogs, the first thing I do is I put an electric collar on them. Now, that might sound crazy to you, but I'll explain why. So, when you have a dog that's very fearful or very anxious, they get trapped in a fight or flight state of mind. The dog, the dog's body is always going haywire, trying to find an escape away from any form of adversity. And again, too much cream, it's time to start stirring in some shit. Now, what happens, especially with the electric collar, is that the pressure comes out of nowhere. And what I mean by that is when I have a leash on the dog and I'm pulling on the leash, it is very evident to the dog that the pressure is being applied by my body. And so now they can fight against me, right? However, with an electric collar, I might not even have a leash on the dog, right? The dog might just be in a penned off area with me standing in the middle of the room, right? The dog doesn't understand at first that that pressure is coming from me. And so now what happens is when I turn that e-collar on and I dial it up to a level that the dog feels, and again, these are low levels. You know, I don't think I've ever gone higher than a level 10 out of 100. And again, I can barely feel a 12. Dogs usually feel them. Dogs are a little bit more sensitive than we are. So they can usually feel it a little bit lower. But again, this is not high levels of pain. This is not correcting or punishing the dog, right? This is tapping them on the shoulder and going, hey, 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 need your attention over here. Now, what happens is when that dog feels that electric stimulation, they begin to move. Instead of just sitting in a corner trembling, which is the dog being trapped in a state of fight or flight, they begin moving because they go, what is this thing on my neck and how do I stop it from happening? Now, if that dog so much as takes one step towards me, I turn the electric collar off and I throw them a treat, which they're probably not going to take in the early stages, but that's fine. I offer food whenever, just to try and keep motivation high. Now, the dog then moves away from me again, the e-collar activates again. Now, keep in mind, application of pressure is a signal to the dog that they're doing the wrong thing. And I want them to change their behavior in order to switch the pressure off. So now the dog starts circling around me again, and before long it starts moving towards me. The electric collar turns off. Before long, that dog is actively moving towards me with curiosity, not fear. What happens with particularly anxious and fearful dogs is they get trapped in a mindset. They get trapped in this idea that everything is out to get them, that everything is dangerous. What happens when we start introducing pressure is we hard reset the brain to think about something else, right? You activate that electric collar and you look at the dog and it's almost like the Windows, boot sound comes on. And the brain now has a completely different thing to fixate on, not just how scared the dog is. So it shifts the dog out of the fight or flight state of mind, and it begins to create focus and immediacy. Because the dog goes, I don't understand what this sensation on my neck is, but I need to stop it. And to stop it, they begin offering alternative behaviors. That dog starts moving towards me, the e-collar turns off, and that is telling the dog, hey, you're doing great by moving towards me. Usually, in a 15-minute session, I have a dog walking right next to me, looking at me, right? And now what also happens when we break the dog out of that fight or flight state of mind, they begin taking food again. I cannot tell you how many times I've put an electric collar or even a slip on a fearful, anxious dog. A dog that the owners have said he would never, ever, under any circumstance, take food outside of the house unless it's just us in the house. It's a very specific set of circumstances where the dog goes, hey, if it's just me and my owner in my own house, I will take food. The second we go anywhere, I'm too stressed to take food. Couple of low stimulations from the electric collar, and what happens is the dog begins taking food even in a setting they've never eaten in before. People don't believe their eyes until they see it. By using pressure in a low-level controlled manner with the dog that is anxious and fearful is the best way to break that spiral of fight and flight and to get the dog working with you and focusing on something other than how fucking scared they are. It is almost like magic, but it isn't, obviously, because nothing in dog training is magic. But that is really important to understand. Again, if you are inexperienced with the use of pressure, that's probably not the place I would start. But when you get better, when you start reading dogs better, when you start really understanding and controlling the amount of pressure you apply, your timing gets better, then you can start working with more difficult dogs. With bigger behavioral issues and especially fear and anxiety type problems. All right, finally. I know this is another super long one. I'm sorry about that, but this stuff is so fucking nuanced and so fucking important that I have to really take my time with it and really try and explain it as well as possible, because it is an absolute game changer when you properly wrap your head around the use of pressure in training. But the last thing I want to talk about before I call it a day is pressure as high-level motivation, what we often refer to as spicy games. Now, this is where the use of pressure becomes at essentially what a lot of people refer to as the gas pedal, right? You have a fucking gas pedal that you install into the dog that increases speed intensity because the dog fucking wants to win so badly. So, what are spicy games? Well, any game has penalties, right? Any prop game has some form of penalty, right? Because if you break the rules, if you don't play the game properly, there's got to be a consequence, right? And so the idea is to try to play within the boundaries of the game and to win by avoiding the aversive. So, one very common thing is slap hands, right? If you don't know what slap hands is that thing where you hold, like people hold their hands facing each other and one person is the slapper. So they try to slap the other person on the hand and the other person tries to pull away to win, right? And to spin around so they get to do the slapping now. Why the fuck do kids love that game? And it's because when you introduce pressure, when you introduce some pain and discomfort, the stakes get so much higher and you become so much more invested into the game, right? Imagine if like reward only is boring. You always win at something, that becomes boring. There is no potential consequence. The outcome is always predictable. Now it's all cream, right? Now you lose your interest in it. Now you fucking need to go seek your dopamine somewhere else. Right? Say if you go to a slot machine. Say you went to Las Vegas and there's one particular machine that costs $1 to play and you're guaranteed to win 50 cents each time. Right? So you put $1 in, $1.50 comes out. Right? You think that is fantastic because you're essentially just making money, right? But the value of that reward is so low that you are doing so much work putting the dollar in, pulling the lever, watching the thing spin out. You get a tiny little reward. You are going to think you're winning in the beginning, but you're very quickly going to tire of that and you're going to stop playing. Why is gambling so addictive? Well, it's because you have invested money into it. You have the potential to lose and to lose big, to be penalized big. But you also have the chance of winning a big reward. Right? And this applies to so many things. Like, again, I've talked about this in the past, but I love playing computer games. Right? But I'm not very good at it. Like I just enjoy it. Like I'm not a professional gamer or anything, but it's what I do to relax and have fun. Now, if I get a new game that is super difficult, there are two ways that that can go. If the game is well constructed and I understand it properly, I will fight harder to get better at the game. However, if the game is too complicated, there's too much adversity, I will give up and I will delete the game. Right. But every game that has rewards, that has a certain level of difficulty, that has a clear progression in difficulty where you can learn the skills of playing the game while being penalized along the way by dying to in a boss fight, whatever it might be. Those are the games you keep coming back to. If I just killed everything right off the bat and just cruised through the game, it'd be boring as shit. Right? So when we start using pressure as high level motivation, what you will get out of your dog is more intensity, more drive. They'll play harder, they'll fight harder, right? And it can be something so stupidly simple as stimming a dog on an electric collar right before you throw the ball. The dog feels the stimulation. It's not high, like we're not trying to like punish the dog at this point, right? But we want him to feel the stimulation as I'm holding up the ball and the dog kicks into drive. The second I throw the ball and the dog starts running, I turn the pressure off. What you'll find is very quickly that dog speeds up and he becomes more intense. He goes further into drive and he brings that ball with what Bart Bellin, the inventor of the Nepo pose system, calls heart and passion. That's what it's all about. It's utilizing pressure to get more out of the dog. I'll finish up with this story because this is hilarious. So this was Christmas. I think 4 years ago. I can't remember exactly, but we were going to someone's house, and there was going to be a bunch of kids there, and I had electric collars because we were going to be on a big open, like non-fenced paddock area with lots of kangaroos, lots of rabbits, right? Which is something that my dogs at that point hadn't really ever seen. So I bring the electric collars because that means if they start going after a rabbit, they're not going to disappear into the forest because I can stop them and I can bring them back. Now, anyways, we're sitting inside. We've had a lot of good food. We've had some drinks, and we start playing some games, right? Games that the kids had gotten for Christmas and stuff. But I have all the electric collars lying on the table. And one of the kids, now these kids were between 8 and 14 years from memory. And one of the kids asked me, what is that? And I said, that's an electronic collar. It's a collar that gives the dog a tiny little electric stimulation so that I can ask them to do something, essentially from a distance. And the kid said, can I try? Can I feel it? And I'm like, yeah, of course. So I turn it up. I turn it on. I tell the kid, put it on your arm like this. And I press the button and I start slowly dialing it up. And suddenly the kid takes it off and starts laughing. He's like, oh, I felt it. And I'm like, and now all the other kids go like, you felt it? I want to feel it. Right? And so we start passing the e-collar around. Right? And every kid gets to try it. Every time they feel it, they're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Now what happens is a competition's created. And every single one of those kids challenged each other to go higher and higher and higher. Now it's a spicy game. And they fucking laughed their asses off. They had the time of their life and they were just stimming themselves at higher and higher level. And all the adults in the room are laughing and the kids are just having the fucking time of their life. That's what happens when you use pressure properly to create a higher level of investment into a game. And this does the opposite of shut the dog down. This powers the dog up. So next time you see someone write a comment on social media that, oh, shock collars shut dogs down, it tortures them, tell them to go fuck themselves and tell them to listen to this. Because introducing that level of pressure into your game, when done correctly, is going to drive the dog through the roof with joy, excitement, and happiness, despite the fact that something unpleasant is happening to them. All right. Thank you so much for listening. Another crazy long one. I know, I am sorry. Like I said, this stuff is so incredibly important and nuanced. It's really important that I really take my time to explain this. I hope you've found these 2 episodes very educational. Again, like I said, I had a lot of good feedback on the first one. Hopefully, this episode will put it all into a little bit more clear perspective and make you feel empowered to actually go out and start trialing, start erring. Again, you're not going to get this 100% right off the bat. That's why we practice and make mistakes with low-level pressure, so that when we become proficient, we can start expanding our pressure knowledge and we can start helping more and more dogs in more and more difficult situations with more and more complex issues. And again, keep in mind, pressure is important, but we also use it in conjunction with positive reinforcement. When I'm doing e-collar conditioning with the dog, there's food every single time they get a rut. It isn't just about pushing and pressing. It's about teaching the dog to understand and to have fun with them. Thank you so much. Been a long podcast. Hopefully, like I said, it has been useful. Now, go train your dog. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Beastly Talks. I hope you found it interesting and that you'll join me for the next one as well. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it so that more people can hear about it. Or if you think this particular episode would benefit a family member, friend or colleague, be sure to share it with them directly. You can follow me on social media at Viking Dog Trainer on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube. Thank you for your support and keep training your dog.